What would you do if saving one stranger's life meant putting your own in mortal danger? What if that choice had to be made in the split second between mercy and survival? Tonight's story takes us deep into the rugged wilderness of Montana Territory, 1882, where the nearest law was 3 days' ride away, and justice often came at the end of a gun barrel. Here in a land where towering pines whispered deadly secrets and every shadow could conceal an enemy, a young woman was about to discover that sometimes doing what's right is the most dangerous thing you can do. This is the tale of Ruby Mitchell, a 24-year-old homesteader who'd carved out a life for herself in the unforgiving frontier, and Federal Marshal James McKenna, a man whose pursuit of justice had painted a target squarely on his back. When their worlds collided on a blood-soaked evening in the deep wilderness, neither could have imagined the storm that was brewing with the dawn. Because in the Wild West, there were no second chances for mercy, no forgiveness for witnesses, and absolutely no sanctuary for those who dared to stand between corrupt lawmen and their deadly secrets. Ruby Mitchell had always believed that a person's true character showed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of choice. She was about to face the biggest choice of her life, one that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. Picture this: a young woman alone in the wilderness, splitting wood as winter approaches, when she hears a sound that doesn't belong, the groan of a dying man. Following that sound into the forest, she discovers a federal marshal with an arrow in his back, bleeding out among the fallen leaves. The smart choice would be to walk away, to pretend she never saw him, to stay safe in her quiet life. But Ruby Mitchell makes a different choice. She drags that wounded marshal to her cabin, tends his wounds, and in doing so, signs her own death warrant. Because the men hunting him aren't ordinary outlaws. They're corrupt bounty hunters led by a man named Dutch Morrison, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way. What follows is a night of terror, a test of courage, and a battle that will determine not just who lives and who dies, but what justice really means in a lawless land. Ruby will face impossible odds, make split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death, and discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most unexpected places. Get ready for a story of unwavering courage, deadly betrayal, and the kind of love that's worth fighting for. Because when the sun rises tomorrow, only the strong will survive. And Ruby Mitchell is about to prove that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. This is a tale of the frontier, where mercy was a luxury few could afford, where corruption ran deeper than mountain roots, and where one woman's choice to save a stranger's life would spark a battle that would echo through the Montana wilderness for years to come. So settle in, because Ruby's story begins on that fateful October evening when her axe bit deep into pine wood and destiny came calling through the forest. The October wind carried the scent of approaching winter through the Montana wilderness as Ruby Mitchell raised her axe high above her head. The blade caught the afternoon sunlight for a brief moment before biting deep into the pine log with a satisfying crack that echoed across the clearing. The wood split clean down the middle, adding to the growing pile of firewood beside her cabin. Ruby wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve and surveyed her work. She'd been splitting wood since dawn, her calloused hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd learned that survival in this harsh country meant staying ahead of the seasons. The October chill was already creeping through the territory, and winter up here in the timber country came fast, stayed long, and showed no mercy to the unprepared. The Mitchell homestead sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs that stretched toward the sky like cathedral spires. It was isolated but not lonely. Ruby had chosen this solitude deliberately, building this life with her own two hands after her father's death 4 years ago. Judge Samuel Mitchell had been a circuit judge before he took up farming, and he taught his daughter that independence was worth more than gold and twice as hard to earn. Ruby's cabin was modest but solid, built from the same pine trees that surrounded it. She'd chinked every gap herself, laid every stone in the foundation, and carved out a life that was hers and hers alone. The nearest neighbor was a day's ride east, and the closest town, if you could call a collection of ramshackle buildings and a trading post a town, was 3 days south through treacherous mountain passes. She liked it that way. Out here, a person's worth wasn't measured by the color of their skin, the sound of their name, or the weight of their purse. It was measured by their ability to survive, to work, to stand on their own 2 feet when the world tried to knock them down. And Ruby Mitchell had proven herself capable on all counts. The sound came just as she raised the axe for another swing. A low, pained groan that didn't belong to the wind, sighing through the pines or the familiar creaking of the trees. Ruby froze, every muscle in her body tensing, as her green eyes scanned the tree line with the sharp awareness of someone who'd learned that in the wilderness, the difference between caution and carelessness was often the difference between living and dying. Living alone this far from civilization had taught her to trust her instincts above all else. And right now, every instinct she possessed was screaming that something was wrong. There it was again, weaker this time, more desperate, coming from the woods behind her cabin. The sound carried pain, exhaustion, and something else that made Ruby's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. It was the sound of someone dying. Ruby set down the axe with deliberate care and reached for the Winchester rifle she always kept within arm's reach. The weapon was well maintained and fully loaded. She learned early that in this country, the only thing more dangerous than being armed was being unarmed. Moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years navigating the wilderness, she followed the sound deeper into the forest. The autumn forest was painted in shades of gold and crimson, the fallen leaves creating a carpet that muffled her footsteps as she moved between the massive tree trunks. Somewhere overhead, a hawk circled lazily, and in the distance she could hear the chatter of squirrels preparing for winter. It was peaceful, almost serene, which made what she found even more shocking. That's when she saw him. A man lay face down in a pile of autumn leaves, his dark hair matted with blood that had dried to a rusty brown. A Lakota arrow protruded from his back just below the left shoulder blade, the wooden shaft decorated with eagle feathers that trembled slightly with each ragged breath he took. His clothes were well made, a leather vest, quality boots, and a white shirt that was now stained crimson. The kind of gear a lawman might wear. A silver badge lay half buried in the dirt beside him, its surface dulled with mud and blood. Ruby could make out the words U.S. Marshal etched into the metal, and her heart sank. Federal marshals didn't end up alone and dying in the Montana wilderness by accident. This man had been hunted, and whoever had done the hunting would likely return to finish the job. Ruby approached cautiously, rifle ready, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. The man could be anyone. An outlaw who'd stolen the badge, a corrupt lawman who'd finally met justice, trouble she couldn't afford. But as she knelt beside him and saw his pale, pain-drawn face, something inside her chest tightened with unexpected emotion. He was young, maybe 30, with strong, honest features that spoke of character rather than cruelty. Even unconscious and dying, there was something noble about him, something that reminded her of her father during his days as a circuit judge. This was a man who stood for something, who fought for justice even when justice fought back. "Mister," she called softly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, deep brown eyes clouded with agony, but still alert, still aware. When he saw her leaning over him, relief flooded his features like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Ruby found herself staring into those eyes, seeing intelligence, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice barely audible, rough with pain and exhaustion. "Thank God. I thought I was going to die alone out here." Ruby's mind raced as she assessed his condition. The arrow in his back was real enough, and the blood loss was severe. His skin was pale as winter snow, and she could see the fever building behind his eyes. Whatever this man had done, whoever was after him, he was dying. She could walk away right now, pretend she'd never found him, stay safe in her quiet, isolated life. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. Instead, Ruby Mitchell made the choice that would change everything. "You're not going to die," she said firmly, slinging her rifle across her back. "Not on my watch. I'm going to get you to my cabin." The man's eyes widened with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. Ma'am, you don't understand. They, they tried to kill me. The men who did this, they'll be coming back. If they find you helping me, then we better make sure they don't find us, Ruby interrupted, already beginning to fashion a makeshift travois from fallen branches and the rope she always carried. What's your name, Marshal? James, he whispered. James McKenna. And ma'am, I need you to know, saving my life might just get you killed. Ruby looked at him steadily as she worked, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. James McKenna, she repeated. I'm Ruby Mitchell, and I've been taking care of myself in these woods for 4 years. I reckon I can handle whatever trouble you brought with you. But even as she spoke the words with confidence, Ruby had no idea that saving James McKenna's life had just signed her own death warrant. Because somewhere in these same woods, 5 corrupt bounty hunters were following a blood trail, and they'd kill anyone who stood between them and their prey. As she began dragging the wounded Marshal toward her cabin, the sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Darkness was coming fast to the Montana wilderness, and with it would come the hunters who'd stop at nothing to silence their quarry forever. The real battle was just beginning, and Ruby Mitchell was about to learn that sometimes doing the right thing was the most dangerous thing you could do. Getting James McKenna to her cabin nearly killed them both. Ruby had to fashion a travois from pine branches and rope, her hands working with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew that time was running out. Every groan of pain from James as she dragged him across the uneven forest floor made her wince, but the alternative was leaving him to die among the fallen leaves. And Ruby Mitchell had never walked away from someone in need. The journey back to the cabin felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. James drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling warnings about corrupt lawmen and deadly conspiracies that Ruby couldn't quite understand. His face grew paler with each passing minute, and she could see the fever building behind his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. By the time she managed to get him inside and onto her bed, his face was gray as winter ash. The arrow had gone deep, missing vital organs by what looked like mere inches, but causing enough damage to put him in mortal danger. Ruby had tended plenty of injuries over the years. Farming was dangerous work, and living alone meant being her own doctor, veterinarian and surgeon all rolled into one. But she'd never had to extract an arrow from a man's back while knowing that killers might be tracking them through the wilderness. I need to get this arrow out, she said, lighting every lamp and candle in the cabin until the room blazed with warm golden light. It's going to hurt something fierce, but if I leave it in there, you'll die for certain. James's eyes focused on her with tremendous effort, and she could see him gathering what little strength he had left. Do it, he rasped, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. But first, you need to know. They're coming for me. Who's coming? Ruby asked, already preparing her tools. A sharp knife sterilized in flame, clean cloth for bandages, whiskey for both antiseptic and pain relief. Bounty hunters, corrupt ones. Each word seemed to cost him dearly, and Ruby could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the chill in the air. They're working with the Blackwood gang. I found their camp, saw them planning a bank robbery in Helena. They tried to kill me quiet-like with that arrow. Ruby's hands stilled as she prepared to cut away his shirt. The Blackwood gang was legendary throughout Montana territory, a group of ruthless outlaws who seemed to stay one step ahead of the law no matter how many marshals and bounty hunters pursued them. If corrupt lawmen were helping them, it explained their uncanny ability to avoid capture. How many are hunting you? She asked, beginning to carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric. 5, maybe 6, led by a man named Dutch Morrison. James's jaw tightened with pain and something deeper. Old anger, personal hatred. I sent him to prison 7 years ago for taking bribes from cattle rustlers. He swore he'd get even someday. The name Dutch Morrison sent ice through Ruby's veins. She'd heard whispers of him in trading posts and saloons. A bounty hunter who'd gone bad, who used his badge and authority to cover his crimes. If Morrison was involved, this was bigger and more dangerous than a simple case of corrupt lawmen. How long before they track you here? Ruby asked, her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest. Dawn, maybe sooner. They'll follow the blood trail I left. James tried to sit up and immediately fell back with a gasp of agony. "Ma'am, Ruby, you should take your horse and ride for town. Leave me here. I'm as good as dead anyway." Ruby looked out the window at the fading daylight. That gave them maybe 8 hours. Not nearly enough time for James to heal. Probably not enough for him to even stay conscious through what she was about to do. But she'd made her choice back there in the forest. And Ruby Mitchell wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially when innocent lives were at stake. "Then we better get started," she said, reaching for her sharpest knife. What followed was an hour of pure agony for both of them. The arrow had barbed points designed to make removal as difficult and painful as possible. Ruby had to work with painstaking care, cutting away tissue that had grown around the arrowhead, while James bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. "You're doing fine," she murmured as she finally managed to extract the bloodied arrowhead. "Just hold on a little longer." Her hands shook as she cleaned the wound and began stitching it closed with the steady precision her father had taught her years ago. Judge Mitchell had insisted that his daughter learn practical skills alongside her book learning, and she'd never been more grateful for those lessons than she was right now. When it was finally over, James was unconscious but breathing steadily. Ruby bandaged the wound with clean cloth and sat back, exhausted. Her dress was stained with blood, her hands trembling from the strain. But she'd done it. James McKenna would live, at least long enough to face whatever was coming with the dawn. But first, she needed to know exactly who she was risking her life for. Ruby searched through James's belongings with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. She found his marshal's commission, signed by the territorial governor himself, and a leather portfolio filled with documents that made her blood run cold as she read them by lamplight. The papers detailed a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of Montana's territorial government. Dutch Morrison and his crew weren't just corrupt bounty hunters. They were part of a network that included judges, sheriffs, politicians, and businessmen who'd been taking bribes from outlaw gangs for years. The system worked with diabolical efficiency. Corrupt lawmen would collect bounties for bringing in criminals, then arrange for their escape so they could rob again. Sometimes they'd even tip off the gangs about upcoming raids or the movements of honest lawmen. The profits were split three ways, between the outlaws, the corrupt officials, and the bounty hunters who made it all possible. James McKenna had been investigating the conspiracy for months, gathering evidence that could bring down half the law enforcement in Montana territory. The documents included names, dates, amounts of money exchanged, and detailed accounts of robberies that had been allowed to succeed. It was enough evidence to hang a dozen men and send twice as many to prison for life, and Dutch Morrison would kill anyone to keep that evidence from reaching the federal authorities in Washington. Ruby set the papers aside and began checking her weapons with grim determination. She had her Winchester rifle, a double-barreled shotgun, 2 Colt revolvers, and enough ammunition for a small war. Her cabin was built like a fortress, thick log walls that could stop most bullets, small windows that were easy to defend, and only 2 entrances that she could watch simultaneously. She'd stocked the cabin with supplies after Indian troubles the previous year, when a band of displaced Lakota warriors had been raiding isolated homesteads. There was enough food and water to last for days, and she'd even dug a small root cellar that could serve as a hiding place if necessary. As she worked by lamplight, setting up defensive positions and preparing for what was sure to be a siege, Ruby found herself stealing glances at the man sleeping in her bed. James McKenna was risking his life to expose corruption and bring justice to a lawless territory. He was the kind of man her father would have respected, someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. There was something else, too. Something about the way he'd looked at her when she'd promised to save his life. Not with the condescending gratitude she'd grown used to from men who thought women were helpless creatures, but with genuine respect and admiration. He'd seen her strength immediately, had recognized her as an equal rather than someone to be protected and coddled. A sound outside made her freeze, the soft whinny of a horse in the distance, answered by another from a different direction. Ruby blew out most of the lamps and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Shadows moved between the trees, at least 3 mounted figures circling her property, like wolves preparing to close in for the kill. They were here. Ruby grabbed her shotgun and positioned herself by the door, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. Behind her, James stirred restlessly, fever burning in his veins and making him mutter incoherently about corruption and conspiracy. He was in no condition to fight, which meant everything depended on her. A voice called out from the darkness, smooth, confident, and deadly as a rattlesnake's hiss. "Marshal McKenna, I know you're in there, boy. Why don't you come on out, and we can settle this like civilized men?" Ruby's finger tightened on the trigger of her shotgun. Dutch Morrison had found them, and she could hear the mockery in his voice, the certainty that he held all the advantages. But he was about to learn that Ruby Mitchell wasn't some helpless frontier woman to be intimidated by threats and bluster. The real battle was about to begin, and Ruby intended to give Dutch Morrison a fight he'd never forget. "This is my property," Ruby called back through the cabin door, her voice steady as granite despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You boys best move along before I decide to fill you full of buckshot." Laughter drifted through the night air, cold, merciless, and filled with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with murder. Dutch Morrison's voice carried easily across the clearing, smooth as whiskey and twice as poisonous. "Well now, looks like the Marshal found himself a protector. That just makes this whole situation more interesting, doesn't it, boys?" Ruby peered through the crack in the shutters, counting shadows moving between the trees. At least 4 men, maybe 5, all mounted and armed. They'd spread out to surround the cabin, cutting off any possibility of escape. These weren't ordinary bounty hunters. They moved with the coordinated precision of men who'd done this kind of work before. Behind her, James stirred on the bed, his fever-bright eyes struggling to focus. "Ruby," he whispered urgently, "you have to understand. They won't just kill me. They'll kill you too. Make it look like Indians did it. No witnesses, no evidence." "Then they're going to be disappointed," Ruby replied grimly, checking the loads in her shotgun. "I've been taking care of myself in these woods for 4 years. A pack of corrupt lawmen is just another kind of predator." Dutch Morrison's voice came again, closer this time. Ruby could see him now, a big man with graying hair and a face that might have been handsome once, before cruelty and corruption had carved their lines into it. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous man in any room. "Now listen here, little lady," he called out, his tone shifting to false courtesy. "We're federal bounty hunters in pursuit of a dangerous fugitive. That man in your cabin is wanted for murder and robbery. You hand him over, and we'll ride away peaceful-like." Ruby had heard enough lies in her lifetime to recognize them when she heard them. "Funny thing about liars, mister," she called back. "They always think everyone else is stupid. I've seen Marshal McKenna's papers. I know who he is and what he's investigating." The silence that followed was electric with menace. When Dutch spoke again, the pretense was gone, replaced by naked threat. "Then you've signed your own death warrant, woman. We can't let either of you leave here alive." Ruby had spent the long hours since sunset preparing for this moment. The cabin was built like a fortress, thick log walls that could stop rifle bullets, small windows that were easy to defend, and only 2 entrances. She'd moved all their supplies away from the windows, filled every container with water in case of fire, and positioned weapons at strategic points throughout the room. "They'll try to burn us out first," James said weakly, struggling to sit up despite his injuries. "It's the easiest way to flush out defenders." "Let them try," Ruby replied, pointing to the metal sheet she'd installed on the roof the previous spring after a lightning strike had nearly destroyed the cabin. "This place won't burn easy." The attack came without warning. The first shot shattered the window beside Ruby's head, sending splinters of wood and glass flying across the room. She dropped low and returned fire with her shotgun, the boom echoing across the clearing like thunder. One of the attackers yelped in pain and surprise. Apparently, they hadn't expected such immediate and accurate retaliation. James had managed to prop himself up against the headboard, a revolver in his trembling hands. Despite his injuries and fever, his aim was steady when he fired through the bedroom window. Another cry of pain from outside told Ruby that his shot had found its mark. "That's 2 of them hurt," she called out, already reloading her shotgun with practiced efficiency. "How many more you want to lose, Morrison?" The answer came in the form of concentrated gunfire from multiple directions. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls and shattered what remained of the windows. Ruby and James kept low, moving between defensive positions, returning fire whenever they saw a muzzle flash. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Short bursts of gunfire followed by tense silence as both sides conserved ammunition and looked for advantages. The attackers tried rushing the cabin twice, but Ruby's strategic positioning and James's accurate shooting drove them back each time. As the hours passed, Ruby began to understand the tactical situation. Morrison's men were professionals, but they were used to easy prey, frightened civilians who would surrender quickly when faced with overwhelming force. Ruby Mitchell was neither frightened nor civilian. She was a woman who'd survived 4 years alone in some of the most dangerous country in America, and she fought with the cold precision of someone who'd learned that hesitation meant death. "You're running low on ammunition," James observed during a brief lull in the fighting. His voice was stronger now, the immediate danger having burned away some of his fever. Ruby did a quick count. He was right. She had maybe 24 rounds left between all her weapons. Morrison's men could afford to waste shots. She couldn't. "Then we need to make every bullet count," she said, moving to the kitchen window where she'd spotted movement. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, creeping toward the cabin with a burning branch in his hand. Ruby took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. Her bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the makeshift torch flying harmlessly into the dirt. "Nice shot," James said with genuine admiration. "My father taught me," Ruby replied. "Said a woman alone needed to be twice as good with a gun as any man." As the night wore on, it became clear that Morrison was growing frustrated. His men had expected an easy kill, one wounded Marshal and a helpless woman. Instead, they'd run into a fortress, defended by 2 people who refused to give up. "This is taking too long," Ruby heard one of the attackers complain during what he thought was a whispered conversation. "Someone's going to notice the gunfire." "Nearest neighbor is a day's ride," Morrison snarled back. "But you're right. We need to end this." Ruby and James exchanged glances. They both knew what that meant. Morrison was about to escalate to try something desperate and dangerous. The fire arrows came just before dawn, arcing through the air like falling stars. Most of them struck the metal roof and bounced off harmlessly, but one lodged in the wooden shutter of the bedroom window. Ruby grabbed a bucket of water and doused it before it could spread, but the message was clear. Morrison was willing to risk burning them out, even if it meant destroying the evidence they were trying to protect. "We can't keep this up much longer," James said, reloading his revolver with the last of his ammunition. "They'll wear us down eventually." Ruby looked at the wounded Marshal, seeing the determination in his eyes despite his injuries. James McKenna was a good man, an honest lawman trying to do the right thing in a corrupt world. He deserved better than dying in an isolated cabin, hunted by the very people who should have been protecting him. But more than that, Ruby realized she'd grown to care about him during their long night of battle. Not just as someone she'd chosen to protect, but as a man she respected and admired. There was something between them now, forged in blood and gunpowder, tempered by shared danger and mutual trust. "Then we make our stand count," she said firmly. "Your evidence needs to reach the federal authorities. That's worth fighting for." As the first pale light of dawn crept through the forest, Dutch Morrison's voice rang out across the clearing one final time. "Last chance, folks. Come out with your hands up, and I promise you a quick death." Ruby Mitchell looked at James McKenna, saw the same resolve in his eyes that she felt in her own heart, and made her choice. "Come and take us," she shouted back. The final assault was about to begin, and only one side would see another sunset. But Ruby had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now, not when justice itself hung in the balance. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in shades of gunmetal and ash. Ruby peered through the shattered remains of her kitchen window, counting the bodies scattered around her cabin. 2 men lay motionless in the clearing, and she could see blood trails leading back into the forest where the wounded had retreated. But her satisfaction was tempered by a grim realization. Dutch Morrison wasn't the type to give up after losing a few men. "They're regrouping," James said from the bedroom doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. His face was still pale from blood loss and fever, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Morrison's not going to underestimate us again." Ruby nodded, reloading her shotgun with some of her precious remaining ammunition. They'd held their ground through the night, but at a cost. Her cabin was riddled with bullet holes. Most of her windows were gone, and she was down to less than 20 rounds between all her weapons. Worse yet, she could feel exhaustion creeping into her bones like cold winter wind. "How many men you think he started with?" she asked, checking the bandage on James's back. The wound was clean and showed no signs of infection, but he'd need days of rest to fully recover. "At least 8, maybe 10, James replied grimly. Dutch always traveled with a full crew when he was hunting dangerous prey. And after last night, he knows we're both dangerous." The sound of approaching horses confirmed their fears. Ruby counted at least 6 riders emerging from the forest, but these weren't the same men who'd attacked during the night. These riders moved with military precision, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. Dutch Morrison had called for reinforcements. "Fresh men," Ruby observed, her heart sinking, rested, armed, and probably angry about what happened to their friends. At the head of the group rode Dutch Morrison himself, and Ruby got her first clear look at the man who'd been hunting James. He was bigger than she'd expected, with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. But it was his eyes that made her blood run cold, pale blue and utterly without mercy. Morrison raised his hand, and his men spread out in a wide circle around the cabin, staying well beyond rifle range. They dismounted in coordinated fashion, taking cover behind trees and rocks with the practiced ease of men who'd done this many times before. "Marshal McKenna!" Morrison's voice boomed across the clearing, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Mitchell, I think it's time we had ourselves a civilized conversation." Ruby exchanged a glance with James, who shook his head slightly. They both knew that any conversation with Dutch Morrison would end with bullets. "We're listening," Ruby called back, positioning herself at the front window where she could see most of the clearing. "Here's the situation," Morrison continued, his tone reasonable and almost friendly. "You've caused me considerable trouble, and you've cost me some good men. But I'm a businessman first and foremost, and I believe in settling disputes peacefully when possible." "What kind of settlement did you have in mind?" James called out, though his hand never left his revolver. Morrison's laugh carried no warmth. "Simple proposition, Marshal. You come out with your hands up along with all that evidence you've been collecting, and I'll make sure Miss Mitchell here doesn't suffer for helping you. Quick bullet to the head, very humane." Ruby felt anger surge through her like wildfire. "And if we refuse? Well, now that's where things get unpleasant," Morrison replied. "See, I've got all day and plenty of men. I can afford to be patient. You, on the other hand, are trapped in that cabin with limited supplies and ammunition. Time's on my side." As if to emphasize his point, Morrison gestured to his men, who began setting up what looked like a semi-permanent camp just outside rifle range. They had supplies, fresh horses, and the confident air of men who knew they held all the advantages. "He's right," James said quietly. "We can't outlast a siege. We need to break out or find another way to get help." Ruby surveyed their situation with growing desperation. The nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away, and even if someone heard the gunfire, it would take time for help to arrive. Time they didn't have. Morrison's men were positioning themselves to cover every possible escape route, and she could see them preparing for a long siege. "There's something else you should know, Miss Mitchell," Morrison called out again. "I've done some asking around about you. Ruby Mitchell, daughter of Judge Samuel Mitchell. Your daddy sent a lot of good men to prison over the years, including some friends of mine." Ruby's blood turned to ice. Morrison had done his research, which meant this had stopped being just about silencing James. This was personal now. "That's right," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a cruel edge. "This is about more than just shutting up a troublesome marshal. This is about settling old scores. Your daddy cost me a lot of money and some good men. Time to balance the books." The psychological warfare was deliberate and effective. Ruby felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her. All the criminals he'd sentenced, all the enemies he'd made in his pursuit of justice. Judge Samuel Mitchell had been an honest man in a corrupt territory, and now his daughter was paying the price for his integrity. "Don't let him get in your head," James said softly. "That's what he wants, to make you doubt yourself, make you scared. But Ruby wasn't scared. She was angry. Angry at Morrison for corrupting the law her father had served faithfully. Angry at the system that allowed men like him to prosper, while honest people suffered. And most of all, angry at herself for not seeing this trap coming. "You want to settle scores?" she called out to Morrison. "Then come and settle them. Stop hiding behind your men and face me yourself." Morrison's laughter echoed across the clearing. "Oh, I intend to, little lady. But first I'm going to let you think about what's coming. Fear's a funny thing. It eats at you, makes you make mistakes. And when you're good and scared, when you're jumping at shadows and seeing ghosts in every corner, that's when I'll come for you." True to his word, Morrison settled into wait. His men took turns maintaining watch while others rested, ate, and cleaned their weapons. They were professionals, Ruby realized. This wasn't their first siege, and they knew how to make it effective. As the morning wore on, the psychological pressure began to mount. Every creak of the cabin settling, every whisper of wind through the trees, every shadow that moved wrong set Ruby's nerves on edge. She found herself jumping at sounds, spinning around to check corners, her finger constantly on the trigger of her shotgun. "He's good at this," James observed, watching Ruby pace the cabin like a caged animal. "Psychological warfare is just as effective as bullets, sometimes more so." "I know what he's doing," Ruby snapped, then immediately regretted her sharp tone. James was trying to help, and taking her frustration out on him wouldn't solve anything. Around midday, Morrison tried a different tactic. One of his men approached the cabin under a white flag, carrying a bundle that he set down just outside rifle range before retreating. "Present for you, Miss Mitchell," Morrison called out. "Thought you might like to see what happened to the last person who tried to help a federal marshal." Ruby's stomach churned as she realized what the bundle contained. Clothing stained with blood, personal effects, and a badge belonging to Deputy Marshal William Hayes, a man James had mentioned as his partner in the investigation. Hayes was getting close to the truth, James said quietly, his face gray with grief and guilt. "I sent him to check out a lead in Billings. He never came back." The message was clear. This was what happened to people who opposed Dutch Morrison and his network of corruption. It was meant to demoralize them, to make them realize the futility of resistance. Instead, it had the opposite effect on Ruby. Seeing the evidence of Morrison's cruelty, knowing that he'd murdered an honest lawman and probably countless others, filled her with a cold determination that burned away her fear like fire burning away chaff. "He made a mistake," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" James asked. Ruby turned to face him, and James saw something in her green eyes that made him take a step back. Not fear, not desperation, but the kind of deadly calm that came over predators just before they struck. "He thinks fear will break us," Ruby said, "but all he's done is remind me why we're fighting. Your partner didn't die for nothing, James, and neither will we." Outside, Dutch Morrison was preparing for the final phase of his siege, confident that psychological pressure and time would break his prey's resistance. But he'd badly misjudged Ruby Mitchell. Fear might break some people, but it had always made her stronger. The real battle was just beginning, and Ruby intended to make sure Dutch Morrison lived just long enough to regret underestimating a judge's daughter. The afternoon sun hung low in the Montana sky when Dutch Morrison finally lost his patience. Ruby watched through the shattered window as he gathered his men around him, their voices carrying across the clearing in urgent, angry whispers. The psychological warfare had failed to break her spirit, and Morrison was learning what many men before him had discovered, that Ruby Mitchell was not easily intimidated. "He's done waiting," James observed from his position by the bedroom window. His strength had returned somewhat during the day, and though he was still pale and weak, he could handle a rifle well enough to make their attackers think twice about rushing his position. Ruby counted the enemy forces one more time. 8 men total, all armed and positioned at strategic points around the cabin. They had her surrounded, outgunned, and outnumbered, but she'd faced worse odds before. Not against men, perhaps, but the wilderness had taught her that survival often came down to determination rather than firepower. "When they come, they'll try to hit us from multiple directions," she said, checking her ammunition one final time. 15 rounds for her Winchester, 8 shells for the shotgun, and 12 bullets for her father's old Colt revolver. Not much to hold off 8 professional killers, but it would have to be enough. Ruby, James said quietly, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him. If we don't make it through this, I want you to know. Meeting you, having you save my life, it's been an honor. You're the bravest person I've ever known. Ruby felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his eyes steadily. Save the speeches for when we're both still breathing, Marshal. We're not dead yet. But even as she spoke the words with confidence, Ruby could feel the weight of the moment settling over them like a shroud. This wasn't like the night attack, when darkness and confusion had worked in their favor. This would be a direct assault by professional killers who'd learned from their earlier mistakes. Morrison's voice boomed across the clearing one final time. Last chance, folks. Come out now, and I'll make it quick. Ruby's answer was to put a rifle bullet into the tree trunk inches from Morrison's head. The message was clear. There would be no surrender, no negotiation, no mercy asked or given. So be it, Morrison roared, diving for cover as Ruby worked the bolt of her Winchester. Take them alive if you can, but take them. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. 2 men rushed the front of the cabin while another pair moved on the back door, and a 5th man provided covering fire from the tree line. It was a coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed most defenders. Ruby Mitchell was not most defenders. Her first shot dropped the lead attacker, rushing the front door, the heavy .44-40 slug spinning him around and sending him crashing into the dirt. She worked the bolt and fired again, catching the 2nd man in the shoulder and sending him diving for cover behind her woodpile. Behind her, James's revolver barked twice in rapid succession as the men attacking the back door ran into his field of fire. One went down immediately, clutching his chest, while the other retreated with a curse that would have made a sailor blush. "They're trying to flank us on the left," Ruby called out, spotting movement through the trees. She switched to her shotgun, the weapon better suited for the close-range work that was coming. A rifle bullet splintered the window frame beside her head, followed immediately by another that punched through the cabin wall and embedded itself in the opposite wall. The man in the trees was a good shot, Ruby realized, good enough to keep them pinned down while his companions maneuvered for better positions. "Cover me," she shouted to James, then burst through the front door with her shotgun blazing. The move was so unexpected, so completely contrary to what any sane person would do when under siege, that it caught Morrison's men completely off guard. Ruby hit the ground rolling, came up firing, and put a load of buckshot into the wounded man hiding behind her woodpile before he could bring his rifle to bear. Bullets whined around her as she sprinted for the cover of the lean-to where she kept her horse. But her sudden appearance in the open had disrupted Morrison's carefully planned assault. His men were reacting instead of attacking, trying to adjust their positions to deal with a defender who'd just become the aggressor. Ruby reached the lean-to just as one of Morrison's men rounded the corner, rifle ready. They saw each other at the same instant, but Ruby was faster. Her shotgun boomed, and the man went down hard, his rifle flying from his hands. From inside the cabin, she could hear James's revolver firing steadily, each shot carefully aimed and effective. Despite his injuries, he was holding his position and making every bullet count. "Where is she?" Morrison's voice roared from somewhere in the trees. "Find that woman!" Ruby smiled grimly as she reloaded her shotgun. Morrison was losing control of the situation, and angry men made mistakes. She counted the shots she'd heard. At least 4 of his men were down, maybe 5. That left 3 or 4 still in the fight, but the odds were getting better. A shadow moved past the opening of the lean-to, and Ruby waited until she could see boots before triggering both barrels of her shotgun. The man went down with a scream, clutching his legs, and Ruby was already moving before his body hit the ground. She made it back to the cabin just as James called out a warning. "Ruby! 2 more coming around the back!" Ruby burst through the back door to find 2 of Morrison's men trying to break in through the window. Her Winchester cracked twice in rapid succession, and both men stumbled backward, one falling immediately while the other retreated with blood streaming down his arm. "How many left?" James asked, reloading his revolver with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and pain. "Morrison and maybe 2 others," Ruby replied, checking her own ammunition. She was down to her last few rounds, but the same was probably true for their attackers. This fight was coming down to who had the will to continue when everything seemed hopeless. "Ruby Mitchell!" Morrison's voice came from much closer now, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. You've cost me 6 good men. This has gone way beyond business now. This is personal. Good, Ruby shouted back. Personal means you'll make mistakes. She was right. Morrison appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face twisted with rage, his rifle held carelessly as he searched for a target. Ruby's Winchester spoke once, and Morrison spun around, grabbing his left arm where her bullet had found its mark. You'll pay for that, Morrison snarled, diving for cover behind a fallen log. But Ruby was already moving, using the smoke from her rifle as concealment to change positions. James provided covering fire from the cabin, his shots keeping Morrison's remaining men pinned down, while Ruby worked her way around to get a better angle. The next few minutes were a deadly game of cat and mouse among the trees surrounding the cabin. Ruby used every trick her father had taught her about hunting, moving silently through the forest while Morrison and his last 2 men tried to track her down. She found the first man crouched behind a pine tree, his attention focused on the cabin where he thought she was still hiding. Ruby's knife took him quietly, efficiently, before he even knew she was there. The second man was more alert, spinning around when he heard his companion's body hit the ground. But he was looking for a woman with a rifle, not one who'd gotten close enough to use her father's old Colt revolver. 2 shots to the chest dropped him before he could cry out a warning. That left only Dutch Morrison. Ruby found him exactly where she expected, crouched behind the fallen log, rifle trained on the cabin, waiting for her to show herself at one of the windows. He had no idea she was behind him until she pressed the barrel of her rifle against the back of his neck. Drop the rifle, Morrison. He froze, his hands tightening on his weapon for a moment before common sense prevailed. The rifle fell to the ground with a thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Turn around, Ruby ordered. Morrison turned slowly, his pale blue eyes studying her face with the intense attention of a man trying to read his own death warrant. What he saw there, the steel resolve, the complete absence of fear or doubt, made him take an involuntary step backward. You killed them all, he said almost admiringly. 8 professional killers, and you took them all down. They made it personal when they murdered Deputy Hayes, Ruby replied, her voice steady as winter ice. And when you threatened me because of what my father did. Judge Samuel Mitchell was a good man who stood for justice. You're nothing but a killer with a badge. Morrison's hand moved slowly toward the pistol on his hip, testing to see if she'd notice. Ruby's rifle never wavered. I wouldn't, she said quietly. You're not going to shoot me in cold blood, Morrison said, trying to sound confident. You're not a killer, Ruby Mitchell. You're a good person, just like your daddy was. Good people don't execute their enemies. Ruby considered his words for a moment, then nodded slightly. You're right. I'm not going to execute you. Hope flickered in Morrison's eyes. James, Ruby called out. Come on out here. I've got something for you. James emerged from the cabin, moving carefully but steadily, his revolver in his hand and a grim smile on his face. Dutch Morrison, he said. Been looking forward to this reunion? Morrison's face went gray as he realized his situation. McKenna, should have killed you when I had the chance. Yes, you should have, James agreed. But you made the same mistake a lot of men make. You underestimated the people you were trying to intimidate. Ruby kept her rifle trained on Morrison while James retrieved the handcuffs from his gear. The corrupt bounty hunter didn't resist as the cuffs clicked into place. He was professional enough to know when a fight was truly over. Your network is finished, Dutch, James said as he secured the prisoner. I've got enough evidence to bring down every corrupt official from here to Helena. The federal authorities are going to clean house. And it starts with you. Morrison looked around at the bodies of his men scattered throughout the clearing, then back at Ruby with something that might have been respect. You fight like a wildcat, he said. Your daddy would be proud. Ruby lowered her rifle for the first time in hours. My daddy taught me that some things are worth fighting for. Justice is one of them. As the sun began to set over the Montana wilderness, casting long shadows across the battlefield that had once been Ruby's peaceful homestead, she realized that everything had changed. She'd proven to herself and to the world that she was capable of standing up to any threat, no matter how overwhelming the odds. But more than that, she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. A partner who respected her strength, who'd fought beside her as an equal, and who looked at her not as someone to be protected, but as someone to be admired. The battle was over, but Ruby Mitchell's real adventure was just beginning. Dawn came quietly to the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed almost mocking after the violence of the previous day. Ruby Mitchell sat on what remained of her front porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the sun rise over a homestead that would never be the same. The clearing around her cabin looked like a battlefield, which in many ways it had been. 8 bodies lay scattered among the pine needles, covered now with canvas from her wagon. Bullet holes dotted the cabin walls like violent punctuation marks, and most of her windows were gone, leaving dark squares that stared out at the world like dead eyes. It would take months to repair the damage, Ruby realized. Months to forget the smell of gunpowder and blood that still clung to everything. But she was alive, James was alive, and Dutch Morrison sat securely bound in her root cellar, awaiting the arrival of federal authorities. "Riders coming," James said softly from the doorway behind her. He moved carefully, favoring his wounded back, but his voice was stronger than it had been since she'd found him in the forest. Ruby rose to her feet, automatically reaching for the Winchester that had become like an extension of her arm over the past 2 days. Then she relaxed as she recognized the led horseman, Sheriff Tom Bradley from Helena, accompanied by what looked like a full company of federal marshals. "Miss Mitchell," Sheriff Bradley called as he dismounted, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the carnage. "Got word there was trouble out this way. Looks like we're a day late and $1 short." "We managed," Ruby replied with characteristic understatement. "Can't say the same for Dutch Morrison and his boys." Bradley whistled low as he walked among the covered bodies, lifting canvas corners to peer at faces he recognized. Morrison's been a thorn in the territory's side for years. Never could prove anything against him, though. "That's because half the people who should have been investigating him were on his payroll," James said, emerging from the cabin with a leather satchel under his arm. "I've got enough evidence here to clean house from here to Washington." The sheriff took the documents James offered and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he breathed. "Judge Harrison, Sheriff Crawford, even some of the territorial representatives. How deep does this go?" "Deep enough to explain why honest lawmen kept disappearing," James replied grimly. "Morrison wasn't just taking bribes, he was eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth." While James briefed the sheriff and federal marshals on the conspiracy he'd uncovered, Ruby found herself walking through her damaged homestead, taking inventory of what could be salvaged and what would need to be replaced. Her father's books had survived, protected by the thick walls of her cabin. Her mother's china was gone, shattered by stray bullets. But the important things, the things that made this place home, were still intact. "Ruby," James called to her from across the clearing, "Sheriff Bradley wants to take your statement about what happened here." Ruby spent the next hour recounting the events of the past 2 days, from finding James wounded in the forest to Morrison's final capture. The marshals listened with growing amazement as she described the siege, the battles, and her eventual victory over 8 professional killers. "Ma'am," one of the younger marshals said when she finished, "I've been wearing a badge for 10 years, and I've never heard of anything like what you did here, taking on Morrison and his whole crew by yourself." "She wasn't by herself," James interrupted quietly. "We fought together. Miss Mitchell saved my life more than once during those battles." Ruby felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, not just because of the praise, but because of the respect she heard in his voice. James McKenna didn't see her as a woman who'd gotten lucky or been helped by circumstances. He saw her as a partner, an equal, someone who'd proven herself under fire. Sheriff Bradley approached her as the other marshals were loading Morrison into a prison wagon. "Miss Mitchell, the territorial governor's going to want to thank you personally for what you've done here. This conspiracy would have cost a lot of innocent lives if Marshal McKenna hadn't exposed it." "I didn't do it for thanks," Ruby replied. "I did it because it was right." Bradley nodded approvingly. "Your father would be proud. Judge Mitchell was one of the most honest men I ever knew, and it looks like he raised his daughter right." As the law enforcement contingent prepared to leave, taking Morrison and the evidence with them, James lingered behind. Ruby found him standing by the grave marker she'd placed over her father's resting place on the hill behind the cabin. "Samuel Mitchell," James read from the simple wooden cross. Beloved Father and faithful servant of justice. He wanted to be remembered as someone who stood up for what was right, Ruby said, joining him beside the grave. Even when it wasn't easy or safe. You honored his memory, James said quietly. What you did here, taking on Morrison and his men to protect a stranger, to make sure the truth came out, that's exactly what he would have done. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Then James turned to face her, and Ruby was struck by the intensity in his brown eyes. Ruby, I have to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Always, she replied. When this is all over, when the trials are finished and the corrupt officials are behind bars, I'm going to need a new partner. The Marshal Service is expanding operations in Montana Territory, and they're looking for people who can handle themselves in dangerous situations. Ruby's eyebrows rose in surprise. Are you offering me a job, Marshal McKenna? I'm offering you a chance to keep fighting for justice, James replied. You've got skills that can't be taught. Courage, determination, the ability to think clearly under pressure. The territory needs people like you. Ruby considered his words carefully. She'd built a life here in the wilderness, carved out a place that was hers and hers alone. But the past few days had shown her something she hadn't expected. That fighting alongside someone she respected, working towards something bigger than just personal survival, gave her a sense of purpose she'd never felt before. What about this place? She asked, gesturing toward the cabin and the land she called home for 4 years. Keep it, James said. Use it as a base of operations. The Marshal Service needs people who know the country, who can move through the wilderness without being detected. This homestead could be perfect for that kind of work. Ruby walked to the edge of the hill, looking out over the vast expanse of Montana Territory stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there were other corrupt officials, other men like Morrison, who used their badges to cover their crimes. There were honest people who needed protection, witnesses who needed someone to stand between them and the killers hunting them. There's something else, James said quietly, moving to stand beside her. Something personal, I need to say. Ruby turned to look at him, seeing something vulnerable in his expression that hadn't been there during their battles. These past few days, fighting beside you, seeing your courage and determination, it's made me realize something. I've been alone for a long time, focused on my work, telling myself that justice was enough. But meeting you, Ruby Mitchell, has shown me that there's more to life than just doing your duty. Ruby felt her heart begin to race, but she kept her voice steady. What are you saying, James? I'm saying that I'd like the chance to get to know you better, not just as a partner in the Marshal Service, but as a woman, if you're willing. Ruby studied his face, seeing the honesty there, the respect that had grown between them during their shared ordeal. James McKenna wasn't trying to rescue her or protect her. He was asking to stand beside her as an equal, to build something together based on mutual respect and shared values. I think I'd like that, she said quietly. James smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since she'd found him wounded in the forest. So you'll consider the Marshal Service? Ruby looked back at her damaged cabin, then out at the wilderness that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. She thought about her father, about the legacy of justice he'd left her, and about the man standing beside her who'd proven himself worthy of her trust and respect. I'll do more than consider it, she said firmly. When do we start? 6 months later, Ruby Mitchell stood in the federal courthouse in Helena, wearing a deputy marshal's badge pinned to the vest of her riding outfit. Beside her, James McKenna watched as Dutch Morrison was sentenced to life in prison for murder, corruption, and conspiracy against the United States government. The network Morrison had built was completely dismantled. 12 officials were removed from office, 7 went to prison, and the territorial government was cleaned up from top to bottom. It was the kind of victory Judge Samuel Mitchell would have celebrated. But Ruby's greatest satisfaction came not from seeing justice done, but from the knowledge that she'd found her calling. She and James had become partners in every sense of the word, professional and personal. Together, they brought honest law enforcement to the Montana Territory, protecting the innocent and hunting down those who preyed on the weak. Ruby Mitchell had started as a homesteader living alone in the wilderness. She'd become something more, a guardian of justice, a protector of the innocent, and a woman who'd proven that courage and determination could overcome any odds. The frontier was still a dangerous place, but it was a little bit safer because Ruby Mitchell and James McKenna were riding together, ensuring that justice would always find a way to prevail in the Wild West. And so, in the untamed wilderness of Montana Territory, where danger lurked behind every pine tree and justice came at the barrel of a gun, two lonely souls found something worth fighting for, each other, and the truth that corruption could never fully extinguish. Ruby Mitchell proved that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right when everything inside you screams to run. It's about standing up for strangers when you could easily walk away. It's about choosing mercy over safety and justice over silence. When she found that wounded Marshal bleeding among the autumn leaves, Ruby faced a choice that would define not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who believed in honest law enforcement. She could have left James McKenna to die and stayed safe in her quiet, isolated life. Instead, she chose to fight against impossible odds, against professional killers, against a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Marshal James McKenna learned that sometimes the best backup comes not from fellow lawmen, but from a woman with a shotgun in the heart of a lioness. He discovered that true partnership isn't about protection, it's about mutual respect, shared values, and the willingness to stand together when the world tries to tear you apart. Together, Ruby and James proved that justice doesn't always wear a badge, and that the strongest people are often the ones everyone underestimates. They showed us that love built on respect and shared purpose can withstand any storm, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary. Ruby's story reminds us that we all face moments when we must choose between safety and doing what's right, between looking the other way and standing up for justice, between protecting ourselves and protecting others who can't protect themselves. What would you do if faced with Ruby's choice? Have you ever had to risk everything to do what you knew was right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear about the moments when you chose courage over comfort. If Ruby Mitchell's story of frontier justice and unexpected love moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more epic tales from the Wild West. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a story of courage, redemption, and the kind of love that's worth fighting for. Your next adventure in the untamed frontier is just one click away. Until then, remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is extend a helping hand to a stranger in need. Thanks for riding along on Ruby's journey, and I'll see you on the next trail.